Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. As we approach the runway to All Hallows Eve, I thought it'd be fun for the library tour to take a little detour into the shadows and check out the shelves of mass market horror. And what you're about to see might shock you, it might thrill you, it might even horrify you. Well, don't say we didn't warn you. We're going to start off with a couple of these that are sort of one-offs of books I have. Ghost Story by Peter Straub, one of my favorites. Absolutely fantastic. Published in the late 70s, I believe. And my favorite of Peter Straub's novels. In fact, it's the only one I own a copy of. The only one of his books. And it's a fascinating book. It's a ghost story. But it doesn't feel that way. It feels very different from just this ghost. And rather, the idea that there's this group of late middle-aged men in a small town who are a prominent lawyer, prominent doctor, things like that, and who are bound by a secret of something that happened in the past, and a younger character who is drawn into that circle, drawn into that secret as it very much manifests in the present through a sort of demon, ghost, something supernatural that is wreaking havoc. It is thrilling but also horrifying, and it's very, very effective. I think it's a very strong book, and I think in this book Straub does what a writer like Stephen King is often trying to do at his very best, and this is one where Straub, I think, manages to outshine King. It's possibly my favorite modern horror novel, so it's one I've read a couple of times. Absolutely love it, and it has an almost like a feel from the old time Hollywood movies as well. That seems to feel like in here. And that takes me to Ancient Images from Ramsey Campbell, a British horror writer, and probably my favorite of Campbell's horror novels. One that centers around a lost film. I love those biblio-mysteries, books that center around a mystery involving a book. That's something my wife and I really enjoy. But I also love books that involve mysteries around films. And this one, there's supposedly a lost horror film involving the great Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. But then there's a whole mystery and scandal around what happened to the film, what happened to the director, what was going on, on the set when it was made a couple generations ago. This book was published in the late 80s, I believe, and it's fantastic. The actual ending manages to surprise and manages to have this element of horror that's not necessarily what we expected, but it's really, really fascinating. It hits on some of those folklore horror ideas that we find in Arthur Machen and other writers. So this is a great one. Highly, highly recommend it, along with Ghost Story. The Hunger from Whitley Streiber is from the early 80s, and this is a movie tie-in edition, so we have Catherine Deneuve here on the front. The back has Deneuve, David Bowie, and Susan Sarandon, all very young. And this is an interesting vampire novel. Streiber has written some other stuff that I think is just basically trash, but this is a good book. In part because it examines this idea around would it be like to live for centuries or for millennia. How does a being cope with that type of loneliness, and what happens if vampires don't die but age, or don't age? A human companion doesn't age the way the vampire does. What does what's going on there? So those explorations are really interesting in this book. Again, there are thrills. There's suspense, and it really does work well. There's a sensuality to the book as well. And I think this is maybe the only one of Streiber's works where that sensuality isn't just awful. So this is again a book I really have enjoyed and enjoyed I'm definitely going to reread it at some point. Last time I read it was on a road trip with my wife, several years ago. Ghost Radio from Leopoldo Gout. This is more recent, 2008. It was pre-2011 because that's the year I read it. And this is a fascinating book. We have sort of almost like a pirate radio station type idea where characters are running sort of this radio show late at night. But it begins to become this talk show where people can call in with scary stories. And then those ultimately have a couple of different connections with our characters. And it works. It's around a medium that is being lost. Certainly by now we podcast much more than radio, but it really works. It works, and it taps into all of those different aspects of our culture. So this is an interesting horror novel that is less horrifying. It more has strange aspects of nostalgia, I would say. I would be remiss if I did not include The Historian from Elizabeth Kostova. My wife and I both love this book. We read it together as a couples read the first or second year we were dating. And then we reread it this past spring, so I'll link that video in the description box. My wife's actually in the discussion. And I have posted a video this month in which I talked about the fact that I think that horror stories are often much more horrifying than horror novels. So these are some of my favorite novels that I think do manage to achieve a really strong element of horror. But there's a lot of great horror stories. Among them, Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Not really that horrifying, but just a great yarn. And these are other stories from Irving's sketchbooks. So we have some that deal with the supernatural, others that are more just, vignettes. But Sleepy Hollow is just a great classic. Don't Look Now from Daphne du Maurier. The title story is horrifying. Just brutal. But the other stories in this collection are quite strong. And I believe NYRB Classics has republished these stories. So, highly recommend it. There is a film adaptation of Don't Look Now. It's strange, without necessarily being quite as compelling, I think, as the story in some ways. So, du Maurier really could tap into suspense, but she could do it in a way that created an element of horror, not just of, shuddering. And then Clive Barker's Books of Blood. I think these are much stronger than any of his novels. And that might be an unpopular opinion, but I think these are strong. The Books of Blood are stories mostly, I believe, from the 80s. Let me check that. Yeah, so these are the 1980s. And there are some really brutal stories in here, but there are also some really interesting, strange ones. There are ones that are like gory and bloody. Barker, of course, can do that. But he also has one in which two cities, basically, villages come together and people climb on top of each other to form these huge, gigantic, almost like cheerleader formations, and then, battle each other. And it ends about as horribly as you could expect. Volume 2, and then Volume 3. The first 3 are very strong. I believe there are 2 later editions, but I think the first 3 are the ones I really love. There's also one that involves various characters basically in a race against death or against Satan. And it's all like a marathon that is sort of a marathon from hell. And that's a very compelling story. We also have Such Stuff as Made of Screams. Such Stuff as Screams Are Made of from Robert Bloch. Bloch has written a few novels. I won't list any of them. But these stories, I think they work. I think they're as strong as Bloch's best novels. That's all I'll say. And then I want to talk about that big guy who writes a lot of horror and the fact that I think his short stories are significantly better and more horrifying. So the early stories of Stephen King are collected in Night Shift, and this is a great collection. If you ever find this and you're into horror or you're into Stephen King and you've never read his short stories, this is his strongest collection. It's his early stories. Jerusalem's Lot is in there. It's a Cthulhu mythos type story. Graveyard Shift, which is absolutely horrifying, involves some rats. Night Surf is only 9 pages long and is sort of an on the beach type story, literally. Group of characters have survived a virus because they had an earlier version of a similar virus. They had A2, now A6 has come and wiped out the human population. And so they're just hanging out basically on a beach. They go swimming, surfing, things like that. Listen to music together, and then they realize that one of them who had the virus is now sick, and what that could mean for the rest of them. 9 pages, perfectly encapsulates horror. Maybe his best story. Trucks is in here, in which trucks become sentient and start crashing into people and stuff, and how do people deal with a Terminator type machines idea. Children of the Corn is in here as well, much more horrifying than the film. So this one book I think is the best material Stephen King ever produced. Later stories are collected in Skeleton Crew. This one has the very long story, The Mist. It also has The Monkey, which has been anthologized frequently. It has maybe my favorite of his middle period stories, Mrs. Todd's Shortcut, which is not a dark story. And it has The Ballad of the Flexible Bullet. So there's some very good stories in here, but Night Shift are really horrifying stories. Different Seasons is an anthology of 4 sections, the idea being that each one matches up with a season. So we have Rita Hayworth in The Shawshank Redemption, The Film is Better Than the Story, novella, I should say. Apt Pupil, very unpleasant experience. And really, Apt Pupil is like 180 pages long and is really like a novel. The Body, which was filmed as Stand By Me, that's one where I think the film and novella are about equal. And then The Breathing Method, which I don't believe has ever been filmed, but is a much stronger piece of fiction, I think, than either Apt Pupil or Rita Hayworth in The Shawshank Redemption. The film's great, though. And then stories from, I want to say, the 90s and like the early 2000s, Everything's Eventual. That titular story, Everything's Eventual, is quite good. I think it's the best one in here. There is a Little Sisters of Illyria, which I believe is a Dark Tower connection. So let's talk about some other writers, though. Like Scott Nicholson. Scott Nicholson does sort of more modern horror, often set in the southeastern U.S. or in Appalachia, and they're strong. The Red Church, I think, is maybe my favorite of his books, and a very effective novel, sort of Cthulhu-type mythos, like Worms Under the Earth, but also we have this literally like haunted church that's been painted red, and the idea of, you know, things from a generation back or 2 generations back coming home to roost again in the present. Very effective. The Manor, which has a sort of like ghost possession story occurring at a manor with a group of wealthy individuals from different walks of life, and one of our key characters is an artist who does sculpture. And that he was an interesting character. He was a very interesting character in The Manor. I enjoyed that one as well. And then The Harvest. This one again is set in the Appalachian Mountains, and it's always the Scott Nicholson's, these books from Scott Nicholson always have this idea of like something, you know, the evil never lies buried. It's going to come to fruit. So I've enjoyed Nicholson's works. Another sequence would be Jonathan Maberry. So Ghost Road Blues. We have a couple of things going on, but most importantly, so Pine Deep is the story here, and there's a sequence of books. And what I really like about this is the way that music is referenced, the way that feel for like the country blues occurs across these books. And so there was a serial killer at one point, and so it's like Spookystown in Pennsylvania or Spookystown in America. And now, again, things are in the present, things are not going well, and Pine Deep is sort of facing that danger again. That is continued in Bad Moon Rising, and then Dead Man's Song. So again, the musical references are a real fun part of that sequence. I had shown Brian Lumley's Necroscope, which is fun. It's sort of a spy novel combined with horror and the supernatural. It's not quite Ghostbusters mashed up with John le Carre, but it's not as far from that as you'd expect. And there is a certain humor to Lumley's work. So there's also this muscular, like, the characters are fighting. They're not just becoming mad and overwhelmed. Like, they're going to fight back. And so Necroscope continues with Vamphyri, and then culminates with the idea that, you know, during the Cold War we've got supernatural spy organizations operating, and so we've got The Source, which is going to take us, you know, across the Iron Curtain into Eastern Europe, maybe even into the Soviet Union, to find out what's going on there. Where does the evil lurk? And so those are very fun books. Real great sense of energy. So let's talk about a couple of the Stephen King novels I do own. Salem's Lot. I really like this book. I really, really enjoy this. I read a lot of King when I was in middle school, high school. My best friend from college is a huge fan of the Dark Tower series, and so he's read everything from Stephen King. But I really like Salem's Lot. I think it's a strong book. Again, ghost story, I think, works very well with it. And they each have their strengths, their moments, and this is probably my favorite book from Stephen King. The Dead Zone, maybe the best Castle Rock work, unless we take out The Body, the novella The Body. But again, it has moments that are really interesting, really fascinating, and then it has the moments where it's just clear King was not in his right mind. Like he has identified that his substance abuse was pretty overwhelming at times, and so that can be evident in some of his works. And then The Shining. This is one where I really am fascinated by the movie and I enjoy the book, and they're very separate works. Like, I don't regard the film really as much of an adaptation of the book. I think they're almost totally separate works. The topiary in here, amazing, just amazing. But I think they're both equally, fascinating works of art that I enjoy. The Stand. My mom loves this book. A lot of people love that book. And then one that I dug out, Pet Sematary, which people have been raving about, so I'm gonna give it a shot. I don't have my copy of Misery, which I think is a pretty good book. The fact that was going to be a Bachman book would have made it by far the best of the Bachman books, which I don't think are very good. And then I have a couple of the Dark Tower books, Drawing of the Three, which is probably slightly better than I remember it being. I read all of these in college, and then various family members have read them and then returned them. The Wastelands, it's okay. Wizards in Glass, I thought it was really cool when I first read it, and I was a much younger person. And I tried rereading, and I thought the Drawing of the Three felt stronger when I was older, and I felt Wizards in Glass dropped in my estimation. And the fact that Song of Susanna was published probably is when I just kind of stopped with King. I return to the stories frequently. I return, periodically to one of his novels, the handful I have, but not much of the modern stuff. And then two that I haven't read, but I'm interested to read, The Scourge and The Switch from Nick Sharman. And I just found these very cheap at a used bookstore, and I was just curious. I was curious about, what they involved. And I haven't read either, but I'll probably hit one of them sometime in the next year. So let me know if you've read any Nick Sharman. I'd be curious to learn. So hopefully you weren't too horrified by what we have or by my opinions. And as always, I hope everybody's doing well. Have a great weekend. Enjoy Halloween if you're celebrating. We certainly will be. Thanks.